All right. So thank you for your patience right there. So tonight's guest, she grew up moving around the world with her journalist parents and siblings. She graduated high school in Cairo, Egypt, and attended college in California. And after completing her BA in biology, she worked as a wildlife technician for 6 years on remote islands in the Hawaiian chain, the Antarctic, the Samoan archipelago, the Bering Sea, and the coast off of California, continuously writing about her experiences. She currently lives, well, it says Wellington, but I know she's in Sweden now. The Last Cold Place is her first book. The Last Cold Place, a field season studying penguins in Antarctica. It's a wonderful book that combines science, memoir, nature essays, and a few history lessons as well. Kirkus Reviews, which is the Bible of book reviews, calls it a compelling blend of memoir, environmental writing, and scientific exploration, an intriguing introspective account. And we couldn't agree more. Please welcome Naira de Gracia. Hi, Nay.
Hi. Thank you so much
Thanks
for
for
having
waking
me.
up.
No problem.
4 o'clock Sweden time. I
Yes.
admire you.
Yes. I just wanted to say that thank you so much to Chaucer's Books for having me. I used to come to Santa Barbara, where my folks live, in between field seasons, and head to Chaucer's to pick up a few books for the field season. And I always had ambitions of being an author, and I imagined my book on the shelves. So it's extra special for me to be able to do this event with you guys.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and I think you should be congratulated. And we put it, I'm sure your dad, who's probably on there right now, he's probably proud, but we've had it on the front table for a little while now. So your,
That's awesome.
your daughter did well, Mr. Gracia. Anyway, talk about, first of all, I'd like to know about your interest in the animal kingdom prior to all your research and professional work. When you were younger, what intrigued you about animal life?
I think when I was younger, I did move around a lot, as I talked about a bit in the book. And I mostly lived in cities, but I usually had some kind of yard. And I think that really getting to know whatever plants I had around me was very grounding for me as a kid when it came to feeling a sense of place and feeling connected to a sense of place. And I think for me, it started with growing tomato plants in the small balcony that we would have, or I had little rabbits in Argentina that used to have little babies and just make little burrows in the yard. And that was such a magical experience for me as a kid to see the process of life unfolding. I think biology wasn't as forefront in my mind, obviously, but once I got to university and I started thinking about what it was I wanted to study, I think it was pretty clear that I was pretty fascinated by life in general, and in particular, the way that ecosystems function and all the little magical, wonderful things that we can learn about other species. It is quite an enchanting world, and I'm obviously still learning, but I think that was a clear choice for me.
So you knew young what you wanted to do.
I feel obviously in retrospect, I can trace the thread and it seems clear to me. But when I was at university, I studied environmental science for a time. And I think for me, the decision to study biology came when I actually worked in the field. I got to spend a summer in Maine on the seabird nesting island there. We lived in tents on the rocks and studied birds during the day. And I realized that this is a real job that people can do that I didn't know before. And that sort of cemented it for me because I wanted to do field work. And I think I was really interested in the experience of field work and the lifestyle of field work. That was a really compelling reason. And if I had to study biology to get there, then I would do that. And so I switched from a more generic environmental science degree to biology to be able to get into that field.
It's a pretty itinerant career where you're moving around a lot. And I'm wondering, when you were a child, you moved around a lot. I mean, you lived in Spain, you lived in South America, you lived everywhere. Did that kind of have an influence on you, seeing different environments, seeing different wildlife there, even going to different places? Is that why it appealed to you as a career?
Yeah, I think that element of moving around and picking up and living out of a duffel bag every 6 months didn't necessarily faze me because of my childhood. And I have this like hunger to see and experience as much as I can. That was probably born from being able to already experience like such a broad diversity of ecosystems in the world when I was really young. Just made me want to see more. Yeah, and I think I fell quite naturally into that lifestyle of moving around in a way that feels very comfortable to me. And I think I'm still phasing out of that pattern now and attempting to be a little more stable. But I obviously just moved from New Zealand to Sweden, so I can't really say it's going that well.
So where to next? No, but you're going to be in Sweden for a little while with graduate school.
Yes, that's right. 2 years.
Yeah. So you work a lot with penguins, especially in documenting this book. But I wanted to know, was that your choice to want to pick that species, that animal?
Yeah, so in the past, before the field season, I'd had experiences working with seabirds on other seabird nesting islands. So because that's where my skill set was, that's the position I applied to. But usually on these islands, there are technicians that also work on monitoring seals. And so I had some experience helping out with the seal work. And I think I probably could have been a seal technician as well. I think I'm not so specifically attached to the avian part of it. Obviously, it was wonderful being a penguin technician. That's a dream job for so many people. But I think the field technician part was the compelling thing to me. And because my background was in seabirds, I fell into the penguin side.
Interesting. And it was funny, I think at the beginning of the book, you had said that, I think it was Mike, your supervisor, was saying that how he can pick things out. However, to you, all the penguins look the same. And I think that's the way it is for all of us, that all the penguins do look the same. So I'll put this photo of, these are chinstrap penguins, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when I first encountered a penguin colony, it's a really overwhelming experience. The first time you go there, you're just assaulted with this like fishy fermented smell and these like really loud sounds of all the penguins like screaming at each other and greeting each other. And it can feel really, it's a lot to process initially, but we go to these colonies every day for about 5 months. So once you get over that initial kind of like wave of delight, you really start to be able to notice, be able to tell the difference between like males and females and tell who the mating pairs are and where in the season the colony is. And it just becomes a much richer experience because you can tell the difference between, all these different demographics of penguins that kind of tell what's going on in the colony. And you just become really acquainted with the rhythms of colony life and the rhythms of penguin life to the extent that we can, obviously, as people, since you don't participate or observe their marine lives, but from land. Yeah.
Interesting. In addition to what other animals there are two different species of penguins you work with.
Yeah.
And then if you could talk a little bit about chinstraps and gentoo.
Yes,
how do you pronounce gentoos? And as well as fur seals, leopard seals, and whatnot. If you can just give us a wide thing so we can have a general idea of.
Yeah, so in Antarctica, there aren't any year-round terrestrial animals. Most of the wildlife that exists there is marine because they live in the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is that ring of ocean around the continent. And it's very, very rich in like a lot of different marine life there. And the engine for the Southern Ocean food web is krill. So krill is this really essential keystone species in that ecosystem, and it fuels like the seals, the whales, the penguins. Krill is a really important food item for them. So when it comes to the peninsula, those species do generally like live from the food in the Southern Ocean, but use land to breed. So even in the interior of Antarctica, there aren't really any animals except like seals that live in the ice and maybe pop up to breathe. So the ocean is like really critically important to conserving Antarctica. And actually, when the treaty was first signed, it only covered the terrestrial part of Antarctica. And that's why CAMLR, which is the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it was developed many years later because scientists were realizing that the ocean was a really critical part of protecting like the Antarctic biome and ecosystem. So all of that to say is that the species that I worked with, and most species that are in Antarctica that aren't like little mosses and little like some grasses as well, are all marine species. So it was like penguins, and then we had various types of seals. We had elephant seals, leopard seals, Antarctic fur seals, and a few weddell seals as well. Weddell seals are really broadly distributed all over the continent. And then when it came to penguins, we had gentoo penguins, chinstrap penguins, and Adelie penguins as well. Adelies they breed nearby, but they don't actually breed in the site that I was working on. So I didn't monitor them, but they would randomly appear sometimes. We also got a couple of king penguins wandering through, a couple of young penguins. Yeah, which was really strange. I find king penguins are very like upright, and they walk in a very human way that I found like a little unsettling. It like more so than they have like a more human like walk, I think, than like many apes I've seen, just because they're so upright and they have their little flippers and they're just like walking along. But there were young ones that were probably just like exploring, or maybe had been blown off course, and they would just like wander around and try to fit in with the chinstraps and the Adelies, and they would just get slapped to death. So,
oh no,
not to death. They were not accepted in chinstrap society.
So how did I mean, obviously you're doing research, but you're also with penguins and animals, and how did they react to your presence?
Yeah, so in Antarctica, there are no terrestrial predators. So on land, I should say, obviously there are squids, and those are seabirds that do steal eggs and chicks, but they don't look like us. Like when you walk on land, generally penguins treat you just like another larger, stranger penguin. They have some hesitation around people, obviously, because we're so much larger, but they're not like strictly afraid in the way that animals might be on other continents that are used to perhaps like being affected by human populations, which is actually a really cool part of it. But obviously there's a lot of protocols around our interactions with the penguins. And everything we do is designed to like minimize disturbance and minimize our interactions with them. So we can't exactly like crawl in and have a cuddle, but it was cool to work with species that weren't like immediately running away from you.
I think that would be the most difficult part for me, is to avoid the cuddle. So
I don't think you'd want to cuddle them if you actually went. It's like a pretty semi-violent situation.
well, yeah, that's true. And also, you had written about the guano and being infested in the scatology of things, and I don't think I'd want it. This period that you were in lasted about 6 months, correct?
Yeah, it's about 5 months.
Okay, 5 months then. And then, so if you can describe the process of, your trip and the basics of what you did in that time period.
Yeah. So basically, a big picture is that these programs are run it's within the Antarctic Treaty umbrella to better assess the health of the Southern Ocean ecosystem, to regulate the krill fishery that operates in the Southern Ocean. So this camp is one of many that are interspersed across the continent. that have the same monitoring protocols and study the breeding colonies of seals and penguins. And seals and penguins are used as indicator species for krill, because krill is actually really hard to study. It's distributed quite in like patches all across the Southern Ocean, and it's just a massive area that's inaccessible in many ways. And so by studying penguins and seals, we can get an idea of where the krill is located by attaching geolocators, like how easy it is to find, by measuring like trip length, like how abundant it is by assessing the success of the breeding season. So we use all of these as indicators to tell us a little more about what is going on in the Southern Ocean ecosystem. And so in these field camps, we hire, or NOAA hires, NOAA is the agency that operates the program in the US. That's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So they operate these field camps and hire seasonal field technicians like me to come down there and conduct the monitoring. So I wasn't doing my own research. I was just there collecting data for these long-term ecosystem monitoring programs. So we operate there in the summer. So it's not like a base where it's there permanently. These camps are only open in the summer. And that's also why our living conditions are a little more primitive than they would be on the base.
Yeah.
So we arrive right at the beginning of the breeding season in October, and we stay until March. So that's the Antarctic summer, the Southern Hemisphere summer. And during that time, we were visiting the penguin colonies every day and writing down like when the eggs were laid. The timing of the breeding season, phenology, is also a really important indicator of how like atmospheric and weather conditions are impacting the colonies. Like, for example, if there's a heat wave really early on in the season, that might trigger penguins to lay early because it'll signal to them that summer has begun. And so that's one of the ways that climate change is impacting these species, is by messing with like a bit of their sense of time. If it's like too hot too early and then there's like a snowstorm and their eggs get buried, it can cause failure in the breeding season. That's just sort of one example. But yeah, so overall we were there for 5 months, visiting our species every day, basically conducting like a range of data collecting processes, including attaching devices, including just observing like the nests and writing down when the chicks were hatching. And we weighed the chicks after 3 weeks, and then we recorded when they fledged. So that's the whole sort of season.
Wow. And there were 5 of you initially, correct?
Yeah, so there's 2 penguin technicians and 2 seal technicians, and actually the program's changed a little bit now. So this is a bit of how it used to be. Now there's 3 people that sort of do everything, but at the time it was 2 and 2. Yeah, I think because there have been like certain budget cuts in the program, they've had to cut back on like the amount of time that the season occurs. So actually my experience was my second season was the last season that technicians were there for all 5 months. Now they go down in December, and it's only about 3 months. And they are able to supplement the information that they collect when they're down there with cameras. So they're cameras that we set up in the colonies, and they take pictures every 30 minutes. And from that picture set, basically you can tell when the chicks hatched and whether they got stolen by a skua, or what the outcome of a nest was. And that's a bit of a pilot study that we worked on when I was there, is comparing like our in-person observations with what the information we're getting from the cameras. And it turns out that it's pretty similar, similar enough to be able to operate like while we were not down there, which is actually great, because during COVID, there wasn't a field season, but there were cameras set up. So that the very basic part of the data set was able to be continued.
So how many years has NOAA been doing this then?
They opened the camp in the early 90s. So it's been about 30 years now. So the reason that these data sets have to be long-term is because, especially in an ecosystem like the Antarctic Peninsula, there's a lot of year-to-year variation in the breeding season. There's just like a very volatile environment. There's a lot of changes, and species are quite inherently adaptable as a base. So you can't necessarily tell atmospheric changes or long-term changes from something like climate change from just like a few years. You need that really long data set that can kind of silence a lot of the year-to-year variations, so you can see those long-term trends.
Were you able to see the forest through the trees? I mean, you're doing a lot of data collecting, a lot of scut work, but were you able to see, while you were doing it, were you able to see your contribution to this whole project?
Yeah, I think there were definitely times where I struggled with that a bit because it does feel very abstract. And as a technician, obviously, we don't really see the outcomes in the same way as the researchers do, because it's a seasonal job for us. We sign up, we do 2 seasons, and then we head on our way. So we're not involved with the meetings with the rest of the Antarctic Treaty, the negotiations around fisheries. But what's really helped me kind of gain a real profound sense of meaning from this work is being in touch with the primary researchers and hearing about seeing the papers that are coming out with the data that we collected, and learning about how actually US data collections from this program have been really pivotal in a lot of the significant decisions that CAMLR has made in recent years around protecting the fisheries. The information that was collected at the Cape played a big part in pushing conservation practices. So that's just been really cool to see happen, even though I'm not involved. It gives you definitely a sense of purpose. But yeah, when you're on the ground every day, it's a little harder to feel connected to that. I think that's something that maybe comes a little later.
Yeah. A couple quick questions, and then I know I'd love to have you read a little bit. You were located in the northern part, closer to Chile, right? Cape Sheriff, was it?
Cape Sheriff, yeah. So the Antarctic is mostly round, except it has a peninsula that sticks up, and it's sticks up in the direction of South America, so Chile. And right at the tip, there's an island in an island group that's called the South Shetlands, called Livingston Island, and that's where the field camp was. So it's actually a little above the Antarctic Circle. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. That's good.
So that's where you were then. And in terms of your period of time there, your 5 months there, you were divided up in seasons of sort involving the lifestyle of the penguin, the life cycle of the penguins. And if you could briefly talk a little bit about that, and then if you wouldn't mind sharing what you're going to read with us.
Yeah, that's a great segue to the passage. But essentially, the life stages of the penguins have 4 phases, and those are the phases in which the book is organized in 4 parts. So when you first arrive, there's still snow on the ground. And because it's the peninsula, the snow does melt in the summer. It doesn't have snow year round, and it is land underneath, unlike a lot of the interior of the continent that's just sheet ice. But basically, when you arrive, the penguins are just waiting around for the snow to melt and collecting some pebbles, and the colonies aren't on a little rise, so the snow melts there earlier than the rest of the island. But basically, they collect rocks and little pebbles, and they build their nests. They find their pairs. They spend a lot of time collecting little pebbles, and it's really entertaining to watch because they fight over pebbles, and they go to many lengths to find the perfect little pebble that they present to their mate. But once they have their nest, they will lay an egg, and then 4 days later, the second egg will follow, and then there's an incubation period of about 30 days, and then the chicks tend to hatch around the same time, and then chick growth is about another 4 weeks. The chicks grow quite quickly because there's pressure on them to get big enough to be able to thermoregulate and stay warm on their own, and also be big enough to be safe from predatory skuas that are the seabirds that are the scavengers of the peninsula. So the chicks grow up really quickly. They go from this big to this big, about 200 grams to 2 kilos. So it's they grow 10 times their size in about 3 weeks. So it's really a quick part of the season, and then they're left on their own. So hatch is when obviously they're hatching and they're quite young, and then creche is the period in which they're big enough to be able to thermoregulate on their own, and their parents leave them alone in the colonies, and they all form these little tight groups, and the nest structure of the colonies kind of falls apart, and it just becomes these little fluffy balls of chicks all together. And when it's sunny, they all spread out and lie on the ground and just pant. But when it's cold, they form these little huddles. So that's the creche period. So creche is just the term that's used in penguin science for that period of time in which the chicks are left alone and they gather together in what we call these creches. And then they start growing their flying feathers. So, or I should say their swimming feathers. So before they had down that kept them warm. And once they reach about 4 weeks, they start growing in their waterproof penguin feathers. And then they fledge, which in this case, obviously for most birds, fledging means they fly for the first time and they leave the nest. But for penguins, it means they jump into the ocean and they leave the colonies to begin their first winter and try to survive. So that's a bit of the overview of the penguin breeding season.
That's cool. And you had a passage that you wanted to share with us?
Yes, I did. So this is from towards the end of the book in February. I should mention that my coworker was called Matt. So he was my penguin counterpart. It was me and him doing the penguin work here. All right. After most of the nests had creshed, Matt and I traded off conducting beach surveys, sweeping the shore below the colonies, looking for non-breeding banded birds that might be coming back to the colonies for the first time. By checking for those known-age birds banded in previous years, we can know which penguins survived the first year of their lives, figured out how to swim and forage, and be a penguin. Penguins start raising their own chicks, usually between 3 and 6 years old. Juvenile penguins were no longer dependent on their parents, but had not yet reached breeding age. I was always reluctant to head out from the skua shack to do beach sweep, as it was the last thing I did in the day before heading back to camp. In February, we all stared into space a lot, just staring at a wall. I could space out forever, especially if I was in a room alone with no one to hold me accountable for my time or to direct my attention. Sometimes at the skua shack, after Matt had gone back to main hut and it was my time to do beach sweep, I had to work hard to rally, get up, change, go off to beach sweep and hike home. The effort seemed superhuman. Once I sat down, it was all over. Even after my feet went numb and sounds were distant ambience and the lights started to fade. 15 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes later, I would sit staring at nothing. Wow, floor, look at that. Once I rallied, I picked my way along the slippery rocks of the intertidal, hungry and tired, my mind everywhere but on the beach I was walking. I would see about 1 or 2 known-age birds on beach sweep a week. In the thick fog, rocks and penguins emerged from nothing and disappeared into nothing. I'd be rubbed raw and cracked open by the daily grind. These fissures exposed the vacuum in my heart to a rush of circumpolar air. There were moments that snapped me to attention. A penguin stood in front of me on a dark rock, pausing from its preening to look at me suspiciously. I read the number on its band with my binoculars before it waddled away into the mist, sleek and flushed from the ocean. It wore a precious known-age band, meaning it had been banded when it was a chick. With a quick reference table in my notebook, I calculated that the penguin was 13 years old. That penguin was born when I was 11 and fledged on these beaches in the months afterwards. By chance, it was one of the 10% of chicks that got banded every year. And every year since then, it had survived by hunting krill and returned to these beaches in the summer. In all that time, the band had not fallen off. There was the penguin popping out of the water on the beach I was walking. At the time, I was walking it, and by the confluence of 1,000 little miracles, we encountered each other, and I could have this knowledge. That bird was 13 years old. I spent a great deal of time during beach sweep lingering at what I thought of as the Chinese train station. It's a great spot under the colonies, a few ledges of rocks leading into the intertidal and out to the ocean. This was where the Chinese came and went from the water. The adults were still returning to the colonies to feed their creshed chicks. The outgoing penguins were filthy, streaked with penguin pudding, exhausted from cramped colony life and hungry chicks. Sorry, I should interject that penguin pudding is just what we used to call the like mucky, shrimpy fermented round of the colonies. It's not like anything resembling actual pudding except in texture. They waddled down to the rocks and waited for a critical number of penguins to assemble, all in a similar state. Once there was a group of them, they tentatively tiptoed up to the waves, and when a big wave splashed their toes, maybe one lurched into it and others followed, leaping into the surf and disappearing entirely. Penguins use their feet and tail as a rudder and propel themselves through the water with their flippers, which are covered in feathers so tiny and tightly packed, they feel like scales. The incoming chinnies, returned from their foraging trips, peek their heads out of the water upon approach, calculating the landing. I imagined they were making judgment calls and measurements, eyeing the rocks and the conditions, deciding upon a strategy, but no matter what they did, their arrival always seemed chaotic. Penguins tumbled in on the crashing waves, foam and feathers, one whirl of energy, the birds scrambling onto the rocks and gripping onto impossible ledges with a single toenail. On calm days, or at low tide, they squirted out of the water and landed on their bellies, quickly righting themselves and looking around with as much dignity as they could muster, which was a lot. Incoming penguins were sleek, feathers smoothed by the water, tuxedos impeccably clean and glossy. Their feet and the insides of their flippers were pink, and they bristled with vitality, full of krill to feed their chicks. I love few things in this world more than a chin-strapped penguin, fresh from the sea. When the water was still and the tide was low, the stillness in the tide pools reflected the penguin's image, framed by pearls of algae strung across the rocks. I watched them picking their way across the slippery intertidal, flippers aloft, eyes calculating, passing by pools of their reflection like pearl-laced portals into another dimension. Right at the point at which the feet of a chin-strapped penguin met the feet of its perfect mirror image, I and all my constructs disappeared.
Beautiful. Your gift for the vivid descriptions plus relating your experience, it gives the reader not only a sense of place, but I think it gives us a sense of what you experienced.
Yeah, thank you.
It's very wonderfully done. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. It's such a privilege to be able to go to Antarctica and experience what I was able to experience. And I'm so grateful for that. And I think it was really important to me to bring that experience to the best of my abilities to people that don't necessarily have that opportunity. So that's great to hear. Thank you.
Well, thank you for letting us live vicariously through you. So, but you know what I really enjoyed most about your book is the balance you put out with your own personal experience. Explanation of science without getting too jargony or too technical. And I really liked how you interjected history, like, Shackleton stories and a few other stories were mixed in. But in combining with the mundane, difficult field work was, I just think that's really a difficult thing to put together as a book. In fact, somebody, Ruby, wanted to know in regards, what was the hardest thing of doing field work with the penguins?
I think the hardest thing was there were some things that we had to do with the penguins that did cause them some stress. And I wrote in the book that we did have a casualty as a result of diet sampling, which is a really invasive sort of process that we used to do. It's no longer done because the animal care committee decided that it was too invasive for the results. So just a disclaimer there. But basically you have to stick a tube down their throat and pump warm water in there and then tip them upside down and massage their neck to get a sample of the krill that they had collected at sea. And it's a really harrowing process for everyone, but obviously as a field technician, you have to put your feelings aside and just conduct the process in the smoothest way possible and in the quickest way possible, because that's what's best for the penguins. But after 4 months of visiting those colonies every day and getting really familiar with them and how much work it takes to maintain themselves and how amazing they are and how resilient they are, it can be really hard to have to disturb them in that way, in a way that feels really, really invasive and stressful for them. So I think it's a difficult part of being a technician is balancing that like really profound kind of love for the species and for the ecosystem you're working in, which is why you know do this kind of work in the first place, with like some of the necessary requirements of the program, which can involve like stressing them out, and in some instances casualties happen, and it's part of the permits that we get for this program, because it's unfortunate, but it does happen, and experiencing that is really tough, I think, especially when it's a direct result of like our presence. But yeah, it doesn't usually happen, and they don't do diet sampling anymore, so that's not a factor. And so I feel the need to add some disclaimers. Like we also have like a control colony that we keep track of that we don't actually do any science on. We just survey them twice a year to compare the impact of our data collecting. And the impact is there, but it's like statistically not significant. So they're fine in the end, but it is like personally like a difficult experience, I would say. Yeah.
I would imagine living with these creatures for so long, it'd be hard to completely detach yourself emotionally from them as living beings and not just part of your research.
Yeah, definitely. I think you start to see them as individuals, and you see their nuances and the rhythm of their lives. And our lives are so stripped of everything else that distracts you, and so penguins are your entire world basically. It's hard not to get attached, and it's hard to see any death as like a number or statistic when you're like so intertwined with their daily rhythms. Which makes something like climate change feel scarier.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you were there during a very difficult time in tumultuous time in American history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right there during the 2016 election. And I was just wondering how you felt about dealing, with possible changes in government regulations and things toward your field. And I mean, how difficult was that while that was going on, thousands and thousands of miles away from you?
Yeah, it was a really bizarre experience because it was like such a significant time in the country, and we were so isolated from everything that was happening. Like we didn't have news. We had this like daily digest that we got emailed, but that was it. We couldn't like follow anything on TV. And it was like this event, that all of us considered like massively significant, that was occurring so far away, and literally nothing about our world changed or reflected that at all. So it was strange to feel really disconnected from like the US at that time, and feel like not really believe it. It was hard to believe because it was just something we read about in an email, and then it was like, nothing else in our world reflected what had happened. It was definitely bizarre, but I think all of us did have some fear and trepidation around like what that would mean for the program, what that would mean for science in general, specifically at such a critical time now with climate change causing havoc in a lot of these ecosystems. It's more important than ever to have boots on the ground, observing the changes. And at the end of the day, they did get their budget reduced, and that was one of the forces that caused the program to cut the field season down. And thankfully, the primary researchers are massively intelligent and resourceful, and were able to figure out ways to keep the data set going, and ways to use technology to be able to capture the same information with fewer resources. But yeah, I think it's a difficult time for science right now. Honestly, the Biden administration has not been exactly a windfall either. So.
Indeed. We still have a few more minutes, so please type in your questions. Along that lines, but being back in the Antarctic, I'm wondering about the isolation and being so far away from not only civilization, but I mean, if something happened, like an emergency that you would have to handle yourself. And I'd like you to just speak on that, just being so far away from everything, not just from the internet. You didn't have internet access or anything like that. What was that like, just being out there?
Yeah, from like hospitals.
Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed.
I think that at the beginning of the season, our one of our primary researchers take us out on a walk, and they have this little talk where it's like, you should not be taking any risks here. Like it's a massive risk just being here health wise, and we don't need to add anything on top of that. And it's true, to get evacuated from there is so dependent on the weather. You can take a helicopter to another base where they have an airstrip and get flown to Chile, but that could be like a 2-day process. Ships take at least 5 days, and that's assuming that there's a ship nearby with capacity to pick you up. So the medical situation is can feel scary. You don't really think about it until something actually happens, and you're like, oh shit. And I think I mentioned in the book, I had the most recent medical certificate. So I did a wilderness first responder course. So I was the primary medical officer on base. So at camp, I should say. So if anything happened, it was basically up to me to like make the decisions and
Wow.
do what needed to happen. And I think that was like a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility that I didn't necessarily feel equipped for. But I was really grateful that nothing dramatic happened in either of my seasons down there. I didn't really have to deal with any like critical situations. Thank God everyone was okay. But in the
Mhm.
seasons after, we have had some evacuations, not like, appendicitis or anything like that, just like preventative evacuations where like you do have to be really careful. If something doesn't feel right, you do have to get evacuated just because you can't really risk something going terribly wrong. But we do have a number of ways to support teams down there. One of them is we have like this big medical case that I think was developed for like ships and other people that work in really remote places, that has a lot of antibiotics and a lot of like prescription drugs that we can use after calling this like medical service on the satellite phone. They can recommend it and prescribe it, and we can then like access those medications. So we do
Mhm.
have like some like support on the medical side down there. But yeah, it's a huge risk, and I think
Yeah.
yeah, it can be scary.
Yeah. Speaking of huge risks, this is a book talk. So I got to ask you about, how this idea came about to document this into a book, and how long did it take you to write? And if you could talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, it took me a really long time. I mean, the book was set in 2016, and it's what, 2023 now.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess when I was down there, I found I'd always written and wanted to be a writer, and I really enjoyed writing. And I think in particular writing towards an audience. And when I was down there, I found my experience like so intense, and the landscape so evocative, that I used to write these like really long letters to my friends and family. And that just ended up into this like massive body of writing that I had after 2 seasons down there. And I had always wanted to write a book, and so I just started thinking about what's the story I would want to tell if this were to turn into a book. But I think the letters became a bit of a base for the manuscript, and I was also just really interested in what landscapes represent to us in society, and how specifically Antarctica kind of functions in the public imagination, what it represents, what do we project onto it in society, specifically Western society, which is what I can speak to, and exploring a bit of that more philosophical side of things was really interesting to me. And I think the story of climate change obviously is like so massive and significant when it comes to the Antarctic Peninsula, and I think really, really being trying to demonstrate how like a couple degrees does actually, climate change just feels really abstract a lot of the time. It's like, what the 1 degree doesn't really matter, and it seems not that significant to us, because maybe like 1 degree warmer to people, it doesn't make that much of a difference. But obviously it has like huge ramifications for an ecosystem that's
Yeah.
structured around like the yearly cycle of ice, and it's a very specific like temperature ranges at which ice forms and ice melts, and on the entire, you know, like Southern Ocean ecosystem is evolved over millions of years to adapt to and live from like that yearly cycle of ice. So a few degrees does actually really matter, and I think it was important to me to tell that story because the Antarctic Peninsula is warming at one of the fastest rates in the world, on par with the Arctic. But unlike the Arctic, there aren't like permanent human societies that are set up in the Antarctic, and there aren't indigenous communities there that, you know, have built their livelihood around like the ecosystems that exist. So that story isn't enter the public consciousness as much as the Arctic. So I think it was important for me to really spotlight the Antarctic Peninsula and bring those stories into more of like a public sphere, because there are a lot of scientists obviously in Antarctica, and that enters the academia and enters papers, but not necessarily like the rest of us that live outside of those spheres. So I think it ended up shaping into a bit of a, the book is dips into a lot of like knowledge areas, but it has, for those of you that haven't read it, it has a thread of history that runs through, where I was really interested in looking at like what has Antarctica represented to us in the past and how have we navigated like our relationship to this continent. And it has like, obviously climate change is a huge piece, but it's underpinned by a narrative of like my first field season down there. So a bit of those three things.
Well, I think that was the appeal about your writing too, is there's not only interspersing everything, but how you wrote relationally, and how things, the history and how the science were interrelated, and how A begat B, and so on and so forth. I thought that was really interesting. Adam had a question. Adam wanted to know what daily life was like at the camp outside of technician work. You know, what did you guys eat? You know, did you play games? Did you socialize? You had the same 5 people there, so
yeah, we got to know each other real well. No, that's a great question. Obviously our means down there are pretty primitive. We all live in like one hut. For food, we had a lot of frozen things. We had a delivery reprovisioning halfway through the season where we got some fresh veggies, but veggies that lasted a few months were mostly just like potatoes and cabbage. So we ate a lot of like Russian and Eastern European inspired food. Really, you know, learned so many ways to cook cabbage. But yeah, we Noah's really great at like providing like a massive pantry and a lot of different options, and food I think is like really important to us because it's one of our few luxuries down there. So really grateful to the program for splurging on getting us like a lot of different fun snacks, and I don't know, a huge pantry that you can just grab anything in. But yeah, it was a lot of like dried food, canned food, frozen food. And then on our time off, like we watch a lot of movies. There's like this massive hard drive that's been passed down from generations of field technicians that people just add stuff to. We had a little projector screen and a projector, and we had to like reorganize the entire hut to like accommodate movie time and like close the blinds because it was always light outside. But we also, there were some card games that were played. I think it wasn't like so much structured social time, but a lot of us were introverts. Also, obviously, I think you have to have like a pretty significant introvert streak if you choose this lifestyle and choose a job like that. So, you know, just like disappearing into your bunk with a good book was a common strategy for me, at least. But we definitely, obviously, over 5 months, you just hang out so much that you get to know people really, really well in a way that it really bonds you, I think. And it's a really special bond, I think, that I still really treasure. I'm really close to the people that I shared my season with still. So it's just like, you know, such a unique experience, and being able to share it with like cool people that are down there too. It really brings you quite close.
Interesting. We got one more, if you can help me out here, Nay.
Yes.
It's from Jill, I think. So if you can, because I'm not sure about the pronunciation of the people. there. So
Um, yeah. So where we were, so there is a tourist industry that operates in the Antarctic Peninsula. It's probably the most visited part of Antarctica because it's the most
mhm.
accessible. It's really close. It's not really close, but it's like the closest you can be to another continent. So a lot of cruises come down to Antarctica specifically to visit like some of the historical sites of like early explorers that built huts, and like there's some bases as well on the peninsula that are
Mhm.
visited. And from what I have seen, I wasn't in an area that was visited by tourists, so I can't speak to this too much. But from what I know, I think that the tourist industry is also quite well regulated, and it's under the Antarctic Treaty, and there's a lot of like very strict kind of like laws and procedures that have to be followed by tourist operators down there because it is like such a highly protected region. So I personally didn't see any like negative impact by tourism, and in fact, I am happy that people are able to have the experience of coming to Antarctica. I don't think it should be an
No.
exclusive thing for scientists. I think tourism is really important, and encouraging people to like form a connection with Antarctica, and perhaps like fostering more of a conservation ethic around it and supporting a lot of these conservation measures. I think having the experience of actually being there is really compelling. So I am actually supportive of like sustainable tourism down there, and I think the way it's done is generally like sustainable and generally like follows like the right laws and is respectful of wildlife. So the
Mm.
island I was on also has like very specific protections around it because it's an important breeding site. So you can't actually go there until unless you have like a permit. And those are through the
Mhm.
Antarctic Treaty, and they're hard to get, and they're generally reserved for people doing monitoring work. So yeah, I'm pretty confident that the tourism industry down there is doing all right. But as I said, I don't know too much about it.
Mhm. Well, we're just about out of time, and I just wanted to thank you so much for for taking the time to talk to us. And here we'll leave everyone with a little image of you there. And if you could just uh, describe the photo, it looks like a GoPro maybe or something.
Yes, I'm pretty terrible at taking pictures, but I would take my GoPro everywhere. So all my pictures are like wide angle now, but that kind of works in Antarctica. Yeah, so this is taken on one of the hills. I think this is late in the season when it's starting to snow again. This is the tallest hill at the Cape. And that's just a bit of like a wide view of pretty much the entire peninsula that we worked on. It's a really small peninsula. It's only about like a couple miles long, and that's like our entire world. Yeah, and there it is. There's some ice there in the ocean that you can see in the distance. But
Interesting. Yeah. So my last question for you, you know, what what did this whole experience mean to you personally?
oh yeah, I think I in fieldwork and specifically in Antarctica, I think you spend a lot of time with yourself, like in your brain and in the stillness and silence of a landscape that so few people get to see. And I think the wonder of that experience is really something amazing that I was so grateful for, and just having the opportunity to experience such a remote part of this earth and being grateful for
Mhm.
this earth and all its wonderful abundance and biodiversity. It just really made me so much more like in awe of all the diverse ecosystems that we're so fortunate to have, and also like helped me know myself like on such a more intense level from so many months of isolation. And I think I'm really grateful for both of those things.
Great. Well, thank you very much for sharing with us. It's such a wonderful book. Everyone, The Last Cold Place, a field season studying penguins in Antarctica. Please go buy the book. You won't regret it. It's a wonderful. And Naira, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.